Hello. Hello, welcome to CPH Conference Day 1, Science is Culture, the virtual edition. I'm Jess Harrop, I co-run Sandbox Films, and I'm coming to you live from my living room in Brooklyn, New York. For those of you who don't know us, Sandbox Films is a mission-driven documentary studio that illuminates the art and beauty of scientific inquiry. We partner with directors and production companies from around the world to tell creative stories about science. And we love CPH Docs, the festival, the forum, and the conference, and how they explore the connections between science and art in such a unique and special way. So much so that they've dedicated this entire conference day to looking at science and art and storytelling. I know that we all wish we could be together today in person in Denmark, but the CPH team has been working around the clock to create this virtual version of the conference for us. And I know that we can now all stay safe in our own homes during these strange and unpredictable times. Due to the circumstances, the program today is somewhat shortened, but it's super exciting. And we're going to be looking at a lot of different ways of how we, as artists and storytellers, can tell stories about science that really resonate with people. Science documentaries have unique translation challenges. We're trying to see the invisible. We're trying to simplify the technical. We're trying to reach new audiences beyond this proverbial choir, reach people who don't necessarily consider themselves science lovers or science enthusiasts. So how do we do that? How do we tell stories about science that bring us together and unify us around our shared cultural values instead of further polarizing us the way some science stories seem to do? To kick off the day, I'm excited to announce our keynote speaker, Dr. Dietram Schweifele. He is coming to us pre-recorded from Madison, Wisconsin, where he is a leading expert in the science of science communication. And he's the perfect way to start the day. So with that, let's take a look at Dietram. Thanks so much.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, especially remotely and asynchronously. We ended up deciding to do this asynchronously, as I said, partly because we wanted to avoid bandwidth issues and weird hiccups as everybody's trying to telecommute right now all over the world. But hopefully this will be at least a brief introduction into the kinds of work that we do here at Wisconsin and really with partners all over the world, partners that are partly in creative documentary filmmaking, other types of filmmaking, partners in museums, partners that are dietitians that are trying to get the best available science across to their clients to help them make better nutritional choices and so on and so forth. And I want to touch on three things very briefly. The first two really briefly, just very quickly talk about the idea of why it is at the very core of what a lot of us are doing, trying to educate audiences and get excitement across about new areas of science, and why that sometimes doesn't work. And then spend a little bit of time chatting about how our personal psychology, how we all function, sometimes undermines that, but also gives us a few pointers for what good levers are for doing it better, and then really spend some time talking about 3 or 4 ideas moving forward. So let me start with the temptation that we all, I think, feel on a semi-regular basis to be public educators. And in the social sciences and academia, like everything, we have a term for this. We call it the knowledge deficit model. It comes from all the right motivations. It comes from this idea that many members of the public or of different publics, and we're all part of these publics, of course, as scientists, as science communicators, don't know as much about the science as they could or should, and so therefore, if they feasted on facts, to use the poster here from Food Evolution, it would be a good thing. So the assumption behind the knowledge deficit model is really twofold. And I put, maybe unfairly, Neil deGrasse Tyson here, who, as one of the popularizers of science and one of the scientist communicators, follows this model almost to a T. If people were just more informed, if they knew more, that model assumes then they would make decisions that are more in line with the best available science. They would make decisions that are similar to what we as scientists would argue they should do. So as a result, the assumption is also that good communication is always about getting information across. And then ideally at the end there's a mic drop and we told them what there is to know and they will learn it and then the world will be a better place. And I'm being intentionally a bit sarcastic and flippant about this, because of course the big irony behind all of this is that the scientific evidence that's out there from social science, from psychology, from communication research, directly contradicts this model. In fact, we know that more knowledge doesn't always produce outcomes that we as scientists would like to see. Let me just show you one example. And this is a study that Brendan Nyhan and Jason Riefler and colleagues at Dartmouth did. And I'm going to just blow up this left panel here. What they worked with, or who they worked with rather, were parents who were, in this first panel, reluctant to vaccinate their children. And then they exposed them to various interventions and then checked where they were later on, which percentage was willing to vaccinate their children and what the likelihood was. And I'm not going to focus on the risk and the narrative and image conditions here, because as you can see in the error bars, they're actually consistent with where the control group is. What I will focus is the comparison is the comparison between the control group and the correction group. What happened in the correction group? What happened there is that they were given CDC, Centers for Disease Control, information about why all the scientific facts and all the scientific consensus told them that it was a bad idea to not vaccinate and why it's a really good idea to vaccinate their children. So they're basically given an injection, if you will, of information. And if you see where they are afterwards, after they've gotten all the corrective information, they're below, in likelihood, where the control group was. In other words, if we hadn't talked to them at all, they would have been more likely to vaccinate their children than they were after receiving the corrective scientific information. And I put a picture here of Jenny McCarthy and Jim Carrey, her ex-husband, who believed that their son's autism, son Ethan's autism, was triggered, as they call it, by vaccines. Of course, this has long been debunked. The Wakefield study, he's lost his medical license. But even those firmly held beliefs about something that is completely nonsensical scientifically are enough to make us reject better information that comes our way. So how does this backfire effect, where does it come from? And this is where I want to tell you a little bit about where the social psychology, the political psychology research has landed. And the key term here is the idea of motivated reasoning. And I put two pictures here just to illustrate the problem. On the left is George Bush, 43. So this was the 43rd president of the United States, right before Barack Obama, a conservative president who had a program during his administration around what he called Snowflake Babies. So these were babies that actually came from fertilized eggs that were used for in vitro fertilization, so for IVF. And for IVF, for in vitro fertilization, of course, you fertilize multiple eggs and you implant and until you're successful and hopefully the parents can have a child. The leftover, the spare fertilized eggs, are often used for embryonic stem cell research. Sometimes they're discarded depending on the wishes of the parents, or the parents could also choose during this program under the Bush administration to give them up for adoption. Other couples could adopt this fertilized egg, could have it implanted and carried to term. This is a baby that came out of that program. And it doesn't matter what your religious beliefs are. It doesn't matter where you stand on stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research. You understand where the moral dilemma is. And you also understand when you look at somebody like Michael J. Fox, who has Parkinson's, who has long argued that we need more research on embryonic stem cell research, where the tensions are here, right? So this is where motivated reasoning comes in. Because motivated reasoning says we all know the facts. Let's assume all of us here in this virtual gathering agree on 5 different facts. We're not disagreeing on them. We all know they're true. All of us are still going to weigh more heavily those facts that fit our priors, as political scientists call it, our prior beliefs, our values, our religious views, our tribal identities, and so on and so forth. And we're going to weigh less heavily, disconfirmation bias, those facts that don't fit. We all agree that they're true, but when it comes to our decision making and our informing attitudes, we're still weighting more heavily those that fit. That's where the term confirmation bias that many of you have heard comes from. The second bullet point, though, really points to something much more pernicious, and that's the idea of biased assimilation. What does it say? It says this whole motivated reasoning leads to a process where we take new facts and we assimilate those new facts into our worldviews. Ideally, of course, it's the other way around, right? Ideally, we adjust our worldviews, our beliefs constantly based on new information that comes our way. But motivated reasoning suggests that no, that's not the case. What happens instead is we take facts and we make them fit. We weigh them up or down so they can fit our worldview, so we can protect our identities, our tribal, our religious identities. And for science, of course, that's super complicated, or that complicates things quite a bit. Why? Because that means something inherently unscientific. It means that the same piece of scientific information can mean different things to different people. And that's hard for us as scientists to grasp. But of course it happens all the time, and it happens to us as much as it does to anyone else, because motivated reasoning is something that none of us are immune from. Let me give you one example. This is one of our former governors, Governor Walker, took a lot of money away from the university, from public schools. And a lot of folks didn't understand why he did that, and they were very concerned that he didn't understand the economic impacts of cutting research on biofuels in this case, and the impacts, the positive impacts that research has on the state's economy. So we happen to have a survey in the field at the time where you see on the x-axis, you see information intake from low to high, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There's a multivariate model controlling for everything, other demographics and other potential confounding influences. I'm just showing you a very simple information intake leads to, on the y-axis, do people think there's a positive economic effect on the state from biofuels research or a negative economic effect on the state? So let me show you the Democrats first. So these are liberals. If they watch television, if they read newspapers, the more they learn about biofuels, the more excited they get about the technology, the more excited they get about the potential economic benefits. On the other side, here are Republicans. The more they learn, the more negative they get, and the more they think that there's actually not a positive economic impact on the state. Is either one of them right? No. They both engage in motivated reasoning. That's the first takeaway. We all do all the time. But the second takeaway is even more interesting. And if you look at where the gap is widest, where polarization is most pronounced, you see that that is among the folks that are most informed, most highly informed. And our study is just one of many that have shown the same thing, meaning polarization tends to occur among those who know the most, who've gotten the most information. So as we're throwing more and more information at people, very often we actually contribute, if we don't think about how and we do that and who we speak to and how we speak to them, we widen gaps and end up increasing polarization. In the US, a lot of that is around religion. In Europe, a lot of that may be around other values, some of them political, some of them religion, some of them values that some groups hold more strongly than others. And other parts of the world obviously being in not a dissimilar situation at all. So what does science tell us then about how to do this better. What do we know from social science? And we've spent 20, 30, 40 years researching a lot of these problems. These are not in all aspects new problems. And I want to touch on maybe 3 or 4 altogether to give you a little bit of a sense of where some of the exciting stuff is happening and also where some of the pathways forward are happening. The first one, I have to give you a disclaimer. That's more of a damper on things. I'm not really ending with on a positive note with that one. But I'm going to start on a positive note, and that is we all know that the right messenger matters. We know that the right messenger allows us to open pathways to group and conversational pathways to groups that scientists often can't speak to directly because they're seen as being an outsider. Messengers can help us with building trust and so on and so forth. So I don't want to take away from that at all because it's crucially important. But I do want to flag the idea that sometimes intuitive or messengers that we think are intuitively good and effective might not always be. And it's a complicated issue that's probably worth a closer look every single time. We were really excited, for instance, when Pope Francis, mid last decade, decided he would come over to the US. Maybe I wasn't excited about it from a religious perspective, but because he had just released an encyclical on climate change, where he basically told Christian conservatives in the US, certainly Catholics, that the science is in. Climate change is real, it's man-made, and we need to do something about it. And very seldom do you get an extremely visible, prominent conservative messenger embracing a message that many conservatives in the US don't like and actually reject. So of course the expectation is, look, this is going to close gaps between Democrats and Republicans finally on climate change. Well, let me show you what happened, because at the time I was at the Edinburgh Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and this is actually in Philly. It was Broad Street, and we're there, and the Pope is on this big billboard. He's actually driving by 3 blocks away. There's the cops. Everybody's smiling as you see the lady on the left in a wheelchair. She cannot believe the Pope is here, and everybody came together. Downtown was closed off. Everybody came together to just watch this, right? So what happened then as the Pope spoke to the American public about climate change? And this is from a public opinion survey where we're plotted on the x-axis. On the left, you see strong liberals. On the right, you see strong conservatives. And I would ask you to look first at the red lines, at folks who were unaware of the encyclical. They hadn't read it. They didn't know much about what the Pope had said. And you see a clear gap in terms of their climate change concern, which is on the Y, higher among Democrats than it is among Republicans. Not surprising. What you would assume after they read from a conservative messenger about climate change is that line flattens. But that's not what happened. What happened, the black line is those who are actually aware of the encyclical, it became steeper. So people actually dug in their heels, and Democrats became even more concerned and Republicans became even less concerned. Exactly the opposite of what we would expect. So what was going on? Well, let me show you another outcome that we measured, and that is if they thought the Pope was credible. And again, the same graph among the unaware, the red, a gap that's probably not that surprising. And then after they became aware of the encyclical, the black line becomes even steeper. So ultimately what people ended up doing, they ended up adjusting their view on the Pope and said, well, the Pope is clearly not credible if he says something that I disagree with on a scientific issue. So rather than changing my views on climate change, I'm going to change my view on the Pope and assume that the Pope is a socialist. And so if he's a socialist, I don't have to listen to him on climate change or on anything else, which was really a large part of the conservative narrative in the US. Because otherwise I would actually have to adjust my views. That is biased assimilation around a messenger at its best and at its worst at the same time. So again, this is not to take away from the idea that really good and effective messengers are crucially important, but it says that for value-laden scientific issues that can be more complicated than we think. But so if it's not the messengers always, it's certainly the message. And this is also something that's not news to you, but I want to highlight a little bit what really is important here, and what I would call connecting, or what other people also have called connecting with the pictures in our heads. And that term actually comes from a journalist, Walter Lippmann, who has written about this in the early 20th century. And when he talked about the pictures in our heads, what he was referring to is the idea that we all have mental buckets, mental categories that we constantly use to process new information. So if I walk toward a door that I've never seen before that has a really weirdly shaped door handle, I still know what the general concept is. It's something to go through. You somehow turn that handle, you open it, you go through. Why? Because I already have that picture in my head. I have that mental bucket. So it's really crucially important for processing information. You can also, and Lippmann wrote about this, see the downsides, for example, for stereotypes, where we may have a mental bucket that we put new people that we meet into, and that's very dysfunctional. But overall, those mental categories do matter. And they matter tremendously, of course, for science communication, because the way we frame or we present scientific topics very often make them more likely to fit one mental bucket than another. I want to show you, for instance, the idea of genetically modified organisms. One of the most successful and effective campaigns around that had absolutely zero facts attached to it. What it did do is add the word Franken to food. So instead of explaining what genetically modified organisms are, what some of the arguments are in favor and against, all I'm saying is Frankenfood. What does that do? It ties the issue of GMOs to a story that we all understand, to a mental bucket. And that is, Dr. Frankenstein creates a monster by putting things together that don't belong together, transgenics. That monster gets out of the lab and out of control. It has unintended consequences as it roams the environment. And it's really difficult to bring back in once it's actually out of the lab. And all of this has happened because of scientific hubris by Dr. Frankenstein and other scientists. And I'm telling that story with a single word, Franken. And once Frankenfood is out there, and once the idea of Frankenstein is out there, of course, as an idea, it's a really great mental bucket to play to. When J. Greg Venter, for example, created synthetic DNA in a lab, so he created DNA from scratch and then implanted it into a live bacterial cell to create life in the lab, as he called it, or to jumpstart life, as some others called it. You saw the magazine, or you see the magazine covers here with Frankenstein in a test tube. Again, very quickly tying the issue to an interpretive mental bucket that we all have. That work actually won a Nobel Prize in 2002 in behavioral economics. Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist at Princeton, won it. Amos Tversky had already passed away, unfortunately, so couldn't win it. And they had done a lot of work on the idea that when we look at the world, it depends on different frames of reference. Walter Lippmann would call those the pictures in our heads. They refer to it as prospect theory of framing. So this idea that we can take the exact same information and evoke different frames of reference and therefore change the interpretation. And science is perfect for this because it's an ambiguous stimulus, if you will, right? Stem cell research could be about curing Parkinson's, or it could be about killing unborn life, embryonic life. So this is, and their work actually drew on really elegant experiments from the 1950s at Harvard on what's called the broken bee stimulus. So this is a broken bee. It could be a 1 and a 3. It could be a B, depending on which experimental group you were assigned to. If you were assigned to group 1, this is what you saw. And your mental bucket immediately says letters, and you immediately read A, B, C. At least you're much more likely to. If you're in group 2, things look very different because I'm activating a different mental bucket for you, a different set of pictures in your heads, and you're thinking numbers. And all of a sudden, the same broken B that in the other group was a B, it now becomes a 1 and a 3. So highlighting the point that I can embed or provide a frame of reference that ultimately ends up changing what mental buckets we put new information in. Why am I setting this up this way? Because it really opens very nice venues for connecting with people on science that they inherently are not really open to. And climate change in the US is a really, really good example. So in the US, for instance, we know from study after study that if you mention the word climate change or global warming to a conservative, he or she is much less likely to listen to you and immediately is going to go into partisan sorting where they reject any climate change message as a liberal message that doesn't fit their prior beliefs, motivated reasoning, identity protection. We talked about this. So what do people like Mitt Romney do, or did? Mitt Romney, who's now a senator from the state of Utah, who ran for president against Barack Obama in 2008. And when he talked to his fellow conservatives about climate change, first and foremost, he didn't talk about climate change at all. What he did is instead, he talked about global competitiveness, about Denmark, Germany, Korea, China, all investing heavily into green energy, and ultimately being able to sell that energy, that technology to other markets all over the world and dominating a fast-growing energy market. His argument to conservatives and to liberals for that matter was, you want to compete on that fast-growing market and all the profits that come out of that market, you need to invest in green energy, in renewable energies. You may not care about climate change, but you do care about markets and the economy. Second value that resonates with people, the idea of energy independence. Do you want to send your children to fight wars in Iraq, in Kuwait, and elsewhere in the Middle East, in countries that you cannot accurately place on a map? And if not, you need energy independence. And one path to energy independence is green and renewable energy. So you want to invest in something, not because it's about climate change, which he didn't even mention, but because it resonates, it deeply goes to values that are important to you, global competitiveness and energy independence. This is the one time also where I will agree with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor of California, conservative of course, and wrote an open letter on Facebook to his fellow conservatives at some point saying, I don't give a fuck if we agree about climate change. And his whole point was exactly that. Look, we can all disagree on climate change and think it's partisan and whatever else. But we all must agree that economically it makes perfect sense if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, you have 320 sunny days out of the year. Not putting solar on top of a parking garage to get electricity is just stupid. So again, saying how can we communicate toward the values that unite us rather than the ones that divide us? And I think this is where we really have a unique role for this community and for how we creatively put messages together in a way that avoids some of the pitfalls from previous communications by framing toward mental categories that really cut across tribal identities, religion, partisanship, and all the things that divide us in an increasing number of societies really globally. So this brings me to the third path forward that I wanted to talk about, and that's entertainment. In my field in communication science in the 70s, we spent a lot of time trying to sort out why there was this really weird correlation between the minutes and hours that people spend watching television and their perception that they could be the victim of a violent crime. So this was not about them watching more news or more crime shows or more violent television. This was just simply how much they watched, how much time they spent watching, and a positive link to becoming the victim of a violent crime. So what happened there? Well, what happened is that basically that for things that we cannot observe, and very often, hopefully, most of us don't observe violent crime on a daily basis. We have never seen anybody gotten stabbed or gotten shot or mugged. Hopefully, many of us haven't or haven't experienced it for ourselves. But we've seen it portrayed all over television and film. So when we can't see things in reality, very often our view of what they look like in the world is cultivated, quote unquote, by these consistent and long-term portrayals in media. Of course, that pretty quickly shifted then also to people looking at, well, what does that do for science? How do views of science and scientists get cultivated? And that's not a trivial question, because Most people have no clue what a scanning tunneling or atomic force microscope is, but they've heard about nanotechnology. At least they've heard it mentioned in movies like Terminator 3 or in comic books or whatever else. Similarly, most people don't understand the upsides, the downsides, and certainly not the technical intricacies of cloning, but they've seen Orphan Black, and they've seen some of the unintended consequences of cloning being portrayed quite powerfully, ironically by the exact same actress, of course. Luke Cage, one of the Marvel spin-offs on Netflix, is CRISPR edited. That's why he's a superhero, at least partly. Designated Survivor, a show where terrorists are trying to use, or white supremacists, I believe, try to use CRISPR edits to attack particular ethnic groups. So really abusing, I guess, or misusing this new technology. And then most importantly, maybe the portrayal of scientists themselves. And the fact that I'm showing you two male scientists here is not surprising, unfortunately, but it's also very intentional. The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper and Doc from Back to the Future. Why am I showing you those two? Because one of the things that I do in my undergrad course, I teach a relatively or larger-ish undergrad course, about 120, 160, depending on which year, undergrads, and they come from different fields. These are 17 through 22-year-olds. They come from political science, from genetics, from law, from journalism, from nursing, from engineering. So really a lot of STEM fields, but also social science fields. And I asked them for an attendance quiz. So they're in class, they have to fill out a quick quiz, and I ask them, give me 5 terms that for you describe a scientist. Just the first things that come to mind. And then I put those together into a word cloud. And this is typically what that word cloud looks like. We just did it actually a couple of weeks ago for one of our last in-person meetings before COVID-19. White lab coat, male, goggles, crazy hair, smart, glasses, old. Nerdy, maybe. Chemicals, quiet, gray, a few other things in there. And you can already see this is like if Sheldon Cooper and Doc had a baby, this is what this baby would look like. And then students, of course, typically say, well, you asked this, and this is just because we talked about this. And then I'm like, well, this is what happened last year when I asked the previous class the same question. And then before that, I asked the same, and then before that I asked, and again, you get the exact same deeply ingrained, cultivated image of what a scientist looks like from television, from films, and so on and so forth. And it's partly our fault as scientists, and partly of journalists and others, given who we give bylines and to some degree screen time to. This graph only shows bylines for commentaries. Who do we invite to write commentaries in the medical profession? This is from JAMA last year. And you can see on the y-axis, you see academic age. So this is just percentiles of where you are relative to all other academics in your field, time-wise. And then does it favor or not favor women with an error bar around it? And you can see that even early, at the very beginning of people's careers, already we're favoring men as public spokespeople of their profession. And that gets worse and worse and worse and worse as we go higher up in academic ranks or higher up in academic age. So partly it is an inherent bias that we just exacerbate. But it's also one that, of course, we can counter with the exact same tools that produced that weird word cloud. We can also do the opposite. And this is partly where some of the efforts came from in what the American National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a partnership between the academies. This is Barbara Klein-Pope, who for 35 years was the communications director for the academies and helped create the Science and Entertainment Exchange. And one really good illustration was a collaboration with Kenneth Branagh when he did Thor, the movie, because the movie, of course, is based on a comic book in which the character who was later played by Natalie Portman was a nurse. Most of the male characters are doctors, medical doctors, and then she plays a nurse. So males are the real scientists and females are not that nurses are not in a scientific field, but you can see where the gender stereotype really kicks in quite heavily there. So they talked to Kenneth Branagh and said, look, you can't do this again. You need to rewrite the script, and you need to make Natalie Portman not a nurse. And they did, and they turned her into a physicist. And Natalie Portman, of course, somebody who has an undergraduate degree from Harvard University, then here on the poster of the movie The Woman of Science, Thor. So trying to really counter some of the very same detrimental portrayals with positive ones, using cultivation as a model. And I think it's really important because, well, for a variety of reasons, but we're talking about fields that chronically underrepresent minorities, chronically underrepresent females, where STEM pipelines, so recruitment pipelines completely favor the types of demographics that are reflected in that word cloud that I showed you. This is also why reports, if you haven't seen it, out of like this at San Diego State University, this was the latest one that came out just early this year, looking back at 2019, portrayals of female characters in the top grossing films. And you see that, yes, things have gotten better, absolutely. But at least in terms of general portrayal, but then at the moment you look at male characters, and if you read the rest of the report, the people behind the camera rather than in front of the camera, things are better, but they're not good. And I think this is really something that all of us, and especially people that fall into my demographic, meaning white males, really need to take seriously. So toward that end, I want to push for one other thing, and I know that this is going to resonate with many of you in the room who are working on this and are doing really creative things with new audiences and new types of science communication. And I want to maybe just encourage that even further by telling you about one initiative that Elizabeth Christofferson, who is the president of the Rita Allen Foundation here in the US, has helped get underway. It's a piece that she and I wrote with Brooke Smith, who is the director for public engagement for the Kavli Foundation in Los Angeles, and she's pushing Elizabeth and the coalition of other funders. I just put some of them here. There are many more, but Burroughs Wellcome in North Carolina, Gordon Betty Moore, Chan Zuckerberg out in California, obviously with Kavli, are pushing for exactly those two things. How do we go beyond the proverbial choir? How do we go beyond people who will always watch science documentaries? How do we get beyond people who already are the converted, if you will? And civic science, I just want to show you a little bit what the idea behind it is, and it hopefully ties it also to the very beginning where it started, deficit models. Because I don't mean to imply that deficit models are a bad thing. In fact, they are really important in times like this. For COVID-19, scientists, medical doctors are communicating what we know about the science. They communicate the science to us. They can tell us how to protect ourselves, how to socially distance, how to flatten the curve. The idea is teach the public, change behavior. Absolutely. This is important for certain, and for patient doctor relationships have always been crucially important. Over time, as I said, those have been usurped, if you will, by more dialogue-focused engagement models. So the idea that it's not just science that needs to be communicated, but science operates in a larger political, societal environment, and there's interactions between scientists and the world around them. That's certainly conversations about the science that they're doing, but also sometimes even co-creating science, citizen science, all these things. The idea is that we need to have a broader conversation about science and its potential downsides and impacts, risks, benefits, and so on. Civic science says we're at a point where most scientific breakthroughs, AI, CRISPR, any type of science that challenges our value system, our religious beliefs, our deeply held values of what it means to be human, for instance, really have to involve everybody. I just put a picture of a demonstration against GMOs in Germany, but public stakeholders from all walks of life have to be involved, and science is just going to be one voice at the table. these broader debates will not have just scientific answers. I think Human Nature and CRISPR, the documentary and CRISPR were a really good example. There is no clear answer. Should we edit the human germline in ways that's heritable? Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. That will require a policy debate, a value-based debate, and hopefully that debate will be based on the best available science and our understanding of that science. But the primary focus of good science communication will have to be on audiences that typically are not involved, people who are likely to have sickle cell disease. So people from particular ethnic groups and racial backgrounds, people who will not be able to afford expensive treatments, genetic treatments that may cost $500,000 or more. How do we get them into the fold of having this conversation? What are the new tools? And what are the audiences that we've traditionally left behind? And I think this is where the exciting next steps are. And all of you who are working on this, I just wanted to highlight the fact that a lot of philanthropic attention is being invested in, or is being focused on these kinds of questions right now. So I think the time is absolutely right, both because it's the right thing to do, but also because I think there's a coalition of the willing coming together, and I think it's a really exciting time. So I'm going to leave it at that. I put a few resources here for those of you who may be interested in reading more. Most of them are open access. Certainly the first 4 are. They're all National Academies reports. The handbook on the science of science communication that Kathleen Hall Jameson at Penn, Dehan Kahan at Yale, and I did is not. But I'd certainly be happy to, if you contact me directly, to share that with you electronically, so that way you can access it easily and cost effectively. Again, I really apologize for not being able to be there in person. If I had any agency in that decision, I would have made a different one. But I'm really looking forward to either interacting with you electronically or hopefully in person before too long. Thank you so much.
So Dietram talks about how we want to bring science into culture. And next up, I'm going to talk to 2 people who are doing just that. So hang tight and we will be right back. Hello, we are back, and I'm so excited to be with Louis Hu is experimenting with new and exciting ways to bridge the gap between science and art. So Louis, hello, thanks for coming.
Hello.
And yeah, could you maybe start off just by talking a little bit about how you became a science communicator?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a delight to be here. So I started in science communication about 10, 11 years ago. I had no idea. It's mostly by accident. It's a kind of a Easter job working with the Edinburgh Science Festival. And I kept doing that alongside training in neuroscience and doing more and more focused on actually thinking about how we can communicate some of the research I was doing in neuroscience as well, with different communities. And I was really passionate, really loved the festivals, but I think something that became more and more, I used to be more and more aware of, is that actually very often with science festivals in particularly generally preach to the converted, the people who are already interested in science. And this is an issue that we have in arts festivals, and and so I was interested in, well, how could we broaden the people that we're working with and building relationships with. And alongside all this, I have a band, a Scottish Ceilidh band, so that's all about traditional music and traditional dance. And the really nice thing about traditional dance, if you've ever tried it, certainly Scottish traditional dance, is it's for everybody. It's all about the participation. And so I started thinking about, well, how could we bring that spirit of getting everyone involved, giving everyone a voice? It's not about how good a dancer you are or how good a scientist you are necessarily, but how do we encourage that participation? And that's how Science Ceilidh as an organization began.
Okay, so tell us about Science Ceilidh. It's really interesting and fun, and can you show us some examples of what it looks like?
Of course. So Science Ceilidh, a Ceilidh, as I said, it means Scottish dancing on one level, but on a second level, also in Gaelic, it means a gathering. It's just bringing people together. Whilst I was in research, we got a grant from Wellcome, and we were interested in, well, how could we literally use these Scottish folk dances as a way of breaking down barriers and preaching well, I guess going beyond the converted and building new communities. And so we would partner researchers with different community groups, we'd work with schools, and the idea is like, how could we use the dance to actually explore and break stereotypes about what science is. And so our first level of work was around actually, as I said, literally bringing these together, and I can show an example of it. It's definitely better seen than spoken about. Cool. So let me just load that up at the moment. So this is our Strip the Leaf. There's no sound. Let me see if I can play this. There you go. So it's an excerpt of the video. You can see each of the dancers' steps has now been used to represent a chemical reaction that happens inside the leaf. So this is Strip the Leaf for photosynthesis. It is tied much more to kind of, I guess, secondary school, high school biology. So it's a little bit more complex than what we do in communities, but it's literally using each of the moves to help represent chemical reactions. And the full video is online. And before, we would have the researcher talking about the research, the science behind it. And then after the video, there's also the researcher linking this to her research. And in this case, talking about how this fits with climate change. So this is kind of how we began as an organization, literally taking Science Ceilidh dance together to break kind of new, I guess, boundaries, but also bring different people into the conversation.
And how does it work? Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, like, how successful has it been? How successful has it been in sort of making people understand the science or connect with the science?
So it's been that project in particular, we saw about 12,000 people across Scotland, and that's focused particularly in the rural areas, so not in the city centres necessarily. And it's successful as the resources are still developing. We're embedded in quite a lot of teacher training programs, for example, for our school part of it, and a lot of our community projects that we started. There's very much a, how do we link general biomedical sciences to the interest of different communities? So in Orkney, for example, one of the Isles of Scotland, they focus on memory. In Shetland, they focus a lot on health and well-being, which again, a very remote place. So how does creativity and well-being and what's the research behind that? And then on the Isle of Lewis, which is on the western coast of Scotland, they focus a lot more on bilingualism and the benefits of bilingualism in the brain and the research behind that. And that's particularly pertinent from a cultural perspective, because on the western coast, Gaelic, which is a national language, is spoken everywhere in Scotland to some degree, but it's particularly strong on the Western Isles. And I guess as a community of practice, we've really developed as an organization to stop thinking, I guess, we still have this element of science and dance, but maybe thinking less about instrumentalizing the science certainly the dance and the art form to explain science, and think more about, well, how can music, arts, culture be a way of building these meaningful relationships? And so very often the things that we, I suppose, piloted in that program have continued into bigger kind of programs for us. So one of them that I've got a couple of videos that I could share as well is looking at exactly this. How does culture, how does bilingualism, how does that support things like creativity and well-being? How does it support people with dementia? And so thinking a little bit differently about how we can build these relationships and with people in slightly interesting ways. So the video I can share, I'll show you the image to begin with, but this is from our partners with Untitled, which is the arts centre on the Isle of Lewis in Stornoway. And so if I just play this here. So we're literally, this is a program that we're continuing, working with carers, working with individuals, the cared for, with dementia, for example. So we're mixing, I guess, music in the care homes, but also at the same time, hands-on activities that people with dementia and their carers can find out more about the research and ask their questions, and we can link that to researchers as well from the cities, which might be a little bit harder to access. And maybe just for a bit of sound, it's one of my favorite little interventions, but certainly as a science communicator or someone in informal science, I've got a short clip of someone who was at the care home. She knew the local artist quite well because the program was established, and that's something that we found really important, is working with practitioners, people that people already trust, intermediaries. And she taught us a Gaelic song. So we've got her a little bit singing here, and I was trying to learn on playing the fiddle as well. So play that. So I'll stop it there, but hopefully you can hear the enthusiasm. And I guess it's certainly one of the highlights in my role in public engagement, is being able to mix this kind of creative practitioner aspect of it with, solid research, and seeing people really light up in very different ways than if it was just giving a lecture. Yeah.
So what has worked sort of the best in these environments, and what hasn't worked as well?
I think given what's worked really well is basically having the space to develop relationships, and that's maybe the hardest bit. So that's the bit that is very difficult to scale. It's very difficult to rush. In fact, you shouldn't be rushing it. And so what has worked really well for us as a program is and in our programs is focusing a little bit less on delivery. And certainly, I would maybe, as a critical friend to the sector, think, if you're going in, rushing in to give science to people, you're really going to meaningfully connect with the minority of people who are already in science engaged. And so what's worked really well for us, especially when thinking about scaling up, is thinking about, well, who are all these trusted intermediaries that we can work with already in communities, who the people who don't engage in science already work with. And so these could be librarians, for example, libraries. It could be youth workers. It's obviously places like schools and teachers. So how do we focus more on thinking about upscaling and working with these people and practitioners who very often have, interest in STEM, but they might not be very confident talking about it because they're not necessarily trained in it. And so how do we give them that confidence? How do we build connections with researchers? How do we develop open source resources so that they can understand more, they feel more connected, and that they can embed that into communities that they work with, that they have spent years and years and have so much expertise in developing relationships with?
Yeah, and I guess in the time of this, we're obviously in the middle of a global pandemic right now, and communicating science and the way science and society are intersecting is really unique. How do you think we should be thinking about communicating and reaching people in this time? And how can we make people trust scientists more and that kind of thing?
I think, yeah, it's really, it's been thinking about this a lot, obviously, given the situation. And again, I think for us, it's just about stressing, it is about relationships. Of course, it's important that we correct and send out good information, but just recognizing that for potentially even the majority of the population, that is not enough. Just like the lecture just before was talking about, it's not about, people don't lack more information. They know very often it's not about having the book thrown at them over and over again. It's about how do we develop these trusts and allow that space for people to really share the kind of the needs, the fears, the very legitimate fears, given the time. And gently, again, having this discourse. And I know that's difficult. It is very difficult from a world, and science communicators are very within that world of scientism. But I think we need to reflect as and think much more like community learning and development, and how do we build trust and relationships over time. And again, I think especially in a time of social isolation, that can't be face to face, even though we recognize that's being one of the better ways. So then again, it's about finding those intermediates. And again, for us, we're working with libraries, who are very often the first port of defense. We're working with arts practitioners, we're working with carers, we're working with youth workers. So these people who are already put work in, how do we support them so that they feel more confident to be able to share that as well? And as you say, it's probably more important than ever that we empower as many of these intermediaries as possible to do their job well and help scientists in that message.
Yeah, totally. And I want to also say to all of the viewers on Facebook right now, feel free to type in some questions if you have any for Lewis. I know that we have another video to share that's pretty fun. Do you want to talk us through that one?
Yeah, so I guess this is a slightly different issue around migration, but one of our programs, we've been working closely with the New Scots community. And again, a really good example where, to be honest, to begin with, we've been working with this community very light touch for about 3 or 4 years, and it's taking about 3 or 4 years before we become, the go-to people to ask for different things, whether that's working with the Syrian engineers and they reach out to us and say, could you put us in touch with some local Scottish engineers so that they can develop their technical English skills and have some sort of befriending. And one of the programs we was asked to do to help with the youth program here in Leith. And so we've got a video of one of our youth work projects with the New Scots, we call them, so kind of migrants and refugees here in Scotland, who are certainly home in Scotland. And this is a nice little clip that they did with our project, looking at the physics of sound. So you'll see the slinkies making some interesting noises. And I'll stop.
Ready?
The video now.
So all together now. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Exit video and go back in there. I'll try that one more time.
Try again. Well, there's another.
Is that working?
Activity, and I like macaroni and cheese, and I love Scotland.
Oh. Technical issues.
Can we go back to the
try one more time?
Making Star Wars one.
Yes. Yes.
And I like macaroni and cheese, and I love Scotland.
Sorry, so that was the end result. So that was when we did the community event at the end, and they were sharing their the things they'd learnt, and one of the participants talking about the learning. Mm-hmm. This is the music making one with the physics of sound. So
okay. So all together now. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, MCFB band.
So that was them with the musical contribution.
And wasn't Star Wars an influence on that one too?
Massively. That's one of our favorite pieces that we can play together.
So you're combining traditional things, traditional music and dance, plus Star Wars, plus physics and science. And it's really like the ultimate culture meets science activities.
Just a bit of geekery to add to it, of course.
Yeah, and what Dietram was talking about too, you know, this idea that so many of the voices that we hear in science communication and from scientists are it's not that diverse. How do you think about that, and how are you trying to combat that in your work?
So again, it's programs like the ones with the New Scots or the youth work programs, looking at, you know, working with people really in depth, looking at building capacity and confidence from very underrepresented backgrounds, really. I guess we have two sayings within our work. So the first one is, if you're not bridging the gaps, you're feeding them. So there's definitely this moral impetus, I think, for us to think about, well, if you're not actually actively working with people who don't necessarily engage in science, then you're just feeding that gap, because if we work with the converted or the privileged, then that gap just widens. So that's one element. And I guess the second element we think about a lot when it comes to that is how do we support people to make culture and not consume it? So again, you know, there's absolutely a place for lectures and experts, 100%. But I feel like a lot of our work is supporting people to recognize that a lot of the things they do overlaps with science. A lot of the questions that they ask are linked, are validated in research, not in terms of the answers necessarily, but in terms of the ability to ask these questions, that curiosity. So how do we give people the kind of confidence to feel like they can contribute and they are allowed to ask these questions and to explore these questions themselves? And obviously at a time where, you know, alternative facts exist, that's a really difficult balance. And that's where the trust and the conversations and the space for safe conversations is really important. But I think it's really important that we bear that in mind. So it's not just about telling people that they're wrong and making people feel like they're, you know, even more rejected or invalidated because of their thoughts and their questions.
Yeah, totally. And this sort of plays nicely into, we got actually an audience question. So I'll read it to you from Laura. The media now has a very important role in how the situation can be handled. I'm assuming that's COVID-19. Basically, people know and act on what the media is telling them. And in many countries, people are very scared, while in others, people don't believe it's happening. What do you think is the best way for the media to handle this?
Ooh, that's a $1 million question. Yes, I agree. I think the media have a massive part to play. I think it's difficult. I think there's a lot of movement around this idea of evidence gathering. So like organizations that are set up to kind of fact check, for example. I think that's a good movement, but I think from the research, it's already, it's better to have that than not have it. But I think if we're only moving towards remedying kind of the false information, by that point, people don't pay attention. It doesn't have anywhere near that kind of significance. So I think maybe there needs to be that process, but even before people broadcast, I think. And obviously there's lots of questions about who would run that and how to make sure that was independent and fair. But I think this kind of idea of like some sort of fact checkers and this type of thing to really kind of make sure that the moral responsibility of media at the moment is really weighted upon, and the best evidence that we have is done before we present things is more important than trying to rectify afterwards, I think.
Totally. And again, it's this idea of trust and building trust in communities for long periods of time. And people don't necessarily always trust some media sources now. So that's a problem.
Yeah, definitely. And it's even in our community programs, we come across people who have very alternative views of lots of different things. And I think it's important that we make the space to have those conversations. And they are difficult. They are very difficult to make sure that balance of, you know, making sure feels heard, but also not validating it necessarily, but making sure that there is that critical space to say, you know, I hear these concerns, I hear these questions.
You broke up a little bit at the end there, but I think we're actually running out of time. So is there anything that you wanted to end on? Any sort of thoughts for this group of filmmakers and documentarians who are watching this program?
I think keep doing the work you're doing. High quality documentaries and videos and resources are so important in times like this, but don't neglect the face-to-face, definitely. And if you are working with teachers and collaboration where possible with people on the ground is going to be your best case forward. And absolutely, if people have any more questions, please do get in touch, and all our resources are free, so you can find us online with all the socials and things like that as well. But yeah, absolutely, keep doing the work you're doing.
And we actually got one more audience question, so maybe I'm just going to try to squeeze it in because they're fun. But
Sure.
And it's a question: what do you think of citizen science, i.e., using people themselves to gather data around something like COVID-19 or something else?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of citizen science. Again, it fits into this doing participation rather than just receiving, thinking of people as receivers and being done to. So I guess to be reflective about citizen science is very often, there are some programs of citizen science which is kind of only relegating the grunt work. So I think we need to make sure that citizen science is genuinely empowering, I think. There has also been some research that colleagues have done looking at how citizen science generally, the people doing it tend to be male, highly educated, white, at least in the UK. And so again, I think there's a responsibility there that citizen science platforms are great, but really making sure that these are embedded within a lot of our community works as well, to make sure that we are encouraging people to do this from more diverse backgrounds as well. And again, it just doesn't become another echo chamber of people who are already science converted, which is the minority. But the more, I think, the more we can move in the direction in a kind of reflective and space, I think the better.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. And in different languages too, like Gaelic or some of these other things that you're doing. So very cool.
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you so much. This has been great. And thanks for joining remotely. And actually, there's one more question. I don't know. Maybe there's time. Is there time? We'll do it really quickly.
Sure, I'll answer quickly.
It's a practical question. I really like the focus on getting people curious about science and participating in scientific thinking rather than simply providing information. But what kind of outcome measures are used for, say, getting grant funding in the context of your organization?
Really great question. To be honest, most of the things that you measure are not the ones that we find the most important when it comes to relationships. So for us, it's about so some of our work is more ethnographic. So we're starting to publish, we're putting together a paper at the moment to put some of our ethnography findings. But again, it's how do you measure the trust within a relationship with teachers or with librarians, for example. It is a very difficult thing, especially when we're not looking for learning outcomes, but we're looking for much more of these kind of attitude changes. I think one thing that we use quite a bit at the moment is this idea of science capital and thinking about relationships to science. So that's one of maybe one very practical thing I can share is this, how do people feel, what's their relationship to science? And we link it to a British Science Association kind of question. So the 4 categories, so there's one is science is not for me. I'm interested in science, but don't go out my way to find it. Third one is interested and actively engaged. And the last one is actually working or studying in science. And so what's nice about those type of rubrics is that we can match that to the UK population, and then we can use different symbolic ways with different audiences to try and participants to try and capture if there's any attitude changes rather than specific learning outcomes.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining, and for everyone watching online. I will be right back with our next guest. Thanks, Lewis.
Thanks very much. Cheers, Jess.
Bye.
Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hi, we're back, and I'm so excited to be here with Dr. Emily Grossman, who has a PhD in cancer research and has dedicated her career to science engagement. So hi, Emily, thanks so much for being here.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
And yeah, I just wanted to start off, you were actually not going to attend the conference in person, but Skype in regardless. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that decision.
Sure. So, I was expecting to be here via Skype or via internet connection in this way, because when I was invited to take part in the conference, I thought, well, no, this is really wonderful and I'd love to be there. But I've actually decided not to fly for environmental reasons. And I'm actually part of quite a few campaigns to encourage more people to stop flying, unless for sort of emergency reasons or essential reasons, and also to encourage other conferences and events to Skype their speakers in, because it really is such an important thing now that we all take real responsibility for our own contribution to the climate and ecological emergency. So, a lot of people don't realize that one single return transatlantic flight, not that, of course, going from the UK to Copenhagen is transatlantic, but just to give you an example, a return transatlantic flight emits the same amount of carbon as 13 years worth of a family's electricity emissions, home electricity combined. And also another example to give is that flying from London to Rome, so that I guess is a slightly more equivalent distance, produces 4 times more carbon emissions than traveling that same route by car, 15 times more than traveling by national rail, and 100 times more than traveling by international rail. So, the Financial Times actually wrote an article recently, and the headline was, "The only way to hit net zero by 2050 is to stop flying." So I used to fly an awful lot for both personal reasons, but mostly for professional reasons. So I would give international talks across the globe. I would run training events for scientists to help them to communicate about their work. And I would be flown to amazing places. I've traveled to at least 20 or 30 different international countries in the last few years. But I've now categorically said, no, I'm not going to be flying. And I want to use my platform to raise awareness about the damage that this is doing to the environment. Now, of course, the most important thing we can all be doing, not right now, because obviously we're in a pandemic right now and there's a lot of other stuff going on, but even in parallel with this, the most important thing that we can be doing, because, even whilst this unfolds, there is going to be a temporary reduction in carbon emissions and a temporary respite, shall we say, for the environment. But we need to be really clear that when we kind of come out of this pandemic, we still need to be really focusing on the climate and ecological emergency. And this year is a really crucial year to start to bring our emissions down. And we need to be really clear that people need to take global responsibility by targeting governments and calling for structural and systemic change. And that's super important. But on a personal level, we can be doing our bit, and flying is a particularly important way that we can be doing that, as well as avoiding the meat and dairy industries, avoiding using cars as much as possible, and also looking at insulating our homes using green energy providers. And those are sort of the key ways that we can help. So I've now said that all of my work from now on, I will either travel by train or by ferry, or I will Skype in. Obviously, that is now completely grounded for the foreseeable future, and I now have no work for the foreseeable future because my work is all about giving talks at public events, which of course have all been cancelled. But seriously, that aside, when we do start to kind of hopefully come back from this, it's really important that we don't forget about the other major crisis on our planet, which actually arguably is going to have, well, not even arguably, is going to have far more lasting effect and impact far more people's lives in the long term than this pandemic.
Yeah, and this conference being virtual is such a good test to see if we can connect this way.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what's going on right now, is people are actually being forced to stay home, and we are actually really seeing some amazing changes where we are realizing that it is possible to go about, not for everyone, I'm not underplaying the devastating impact that it's having on a lot of people's livelihoods right now, and of course a lot of people's health, but also those who are forced to stay home and not work. I'm absolutely not underplaying that. But we are also seeing a huge amount of people coming together on social media, on Zoom, on Skype, on conference calls, who are being able to carry on with their work and actually being able to do that in a way that isn't damaging the environment.
Yeah, totally. And I want to take a quick step back from this. I want to get back to climate change in a minute, but you've done so much science communication. You've written articles, you've given so many talks, you've appeared on so many television programs. What in your mind has been, give us a little background on like what's been the most successful ways in which you've really cut through and communicated science to people and gotten people interested who might not have been interested to start with, and what hasn't worked as well in your opinion?
Sure, thank you. It's a really interesting question. So my sort of something that I live by, one of my favorite quotes is it's unclear exactly what the quote is, but it's something, it was supposedly Albert Einstein who said something like, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Or if you can't explain it in a one sentence, or if you can't explain it to a child, there's various versions of that quote. And I really believe in that. People often sort of say, oh, but, is this talk aimed at kids or is it aimed at adults? Or is this book or this article, who's it aimed at? And I'm like, well, actually, it shouldn't really matter, because the way that I see science communication is that everything should be explained in a way that a child can understand it. And everything should be explained, if possible, in a way that's very, very concise and very simple. Obviously, you can up technical language and things like that, depending on if you've got a more academic audience. I'm not being sort of flippant about that. But, one of my other favorite quotes, which I always use when I train people in communication skills is I'm so sorry I wrote you such a long letter. I simply didn't have time to write you a short one. So for me, the essence of science communication is finding the simplest and shortest possible way to explain something using the simplest language and the fewest words. And actually, that may seem from the outside like it's easy when you see someone doing it and doing it well, but actually that's the skill, and that's what takes a lot of time. And I've just spent many months working with other amazing climate scientists to write a hugely long document about the science of the climate and ecological emergency and everything that's going on the planet. And the next task is then to condense it down and then to condense it down and to end up with something really, really short and concise. So, and that's what takes the time, but I think that's what's most effective. And to that end, I think some of the most effective science communication that I've been involved with has actually been very mainstream, which was on a celebrity panel show on Sky, which is called Duck Quacks Don't Echo, which some people might have seen, which was sort of very sort of fun and light-hearted and flippant, and myself and two other science, or not flippant in the sense that it's not real science, because it was, but it might have been seen as kind of just a bit of fun. But myself and the two other brilliant scientists, science communicators, who were experts on the panel of experts on that show, we spent a lot of time and a lot of energy kind of answering questions from celebrities and from the studio audience and about sort of weird, strange science facts. And we would kind of condense it down to kind of 30 seconds of a sort of pithy explanation. And people would go away and they'd remember it. And that was because we were able to kind of express it in a way that was simple language, that was fun, that was lighthearted, maybe put in a sort of a joke or something fun with it, and left people with kind of the real bare bones of what it was that we were trying to explain. So, my favorite is, did you know that you can block a tickle? And there's lots of sort of complicated science in there if you want to find it, but the bottom line is that our brain, in order to feel ticklish, our brain needs to feel surprised, because that's how we've evolved, partly to feel ticklish with surprising feelings on our skin in case it's some kind of nasty creature that might bite us or sting us or scratch it, so we feel ticklish and we flick it away and get rid of it. Then of course there's also social bonding that comes through being ticklish, with a slightly separate type of tickle. But the basic science is that our brain needs to be surprised. If it's our own hands on our own skin, our brain can make a quick prediction about that, how that's going to feel. And in doing so, it blocks the tickly feelings so that we don't fall about laughing every time we touch our feet and put on our shoes and socks. So using that logic, we can simply, if someone is tickling you, all you need to do is put your hands on their hands whilst they're tickling you. Your brain will think it's your own hands. It will be able to predict how that's going to feel very, very quickly, and it will be able to block the tickly feelings. So there's lots of very complex science in there if you want to find it. But the bottom line is, if you can kind of condense it to just the the bare bones of the logic of the science, then people will get that. And I think that's where the skill and that's where the technique in science communication comes, even if it's a very complicated topic and very complex, is to kind of distill it down to the basics. And I really like, there's some research as well in terms of what it's actually used as giving good speeches, but I think it applies very well to science communication, is that it's really good if we can break our arguments down into sort of 3 areas. So the 3 areas in terms of giving great speeches are always said, sorry, I'm just bringing it up. So the areas are said to be logos, ethos, and pathos or pathos. So logos is the logical argument, you know, if you put your hands on someone else's hands, this is why it will block the tickle, blah, blah, blah. This is what your brain's doing. Or in the case of, let's say, spreading of the pandemic right now, the logic is if you go outside and you don't have symptoms, it could take 14 days for you to show your symptoms. In that 14 days, you might think you're totally fine. During that time, you might walk around and breathe on or touch things that other people are touching. Those other people may then get that virus before you even know you've got it. They could then take it into themselves and they could go and infect someone, particularly someone who is vulnerable or over 70 or has an underlying health condition. So you've got your logical argument, but that on its own, which a lot of scientists think often that that's enough. And I think the role of science communication is to say, actually, we need more than that. So that is one part. The second part is the ethos, which is the trustworthiness based on the source, based on who are you to say this? Why do you have the authority to say this? So, you know, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an expert in virus transmission, neither am I a climate scientist. But I have authority to some extent because I have a degree in molecular biology. I have a PhD in cancer research, which was microbiology. And also I've done a lot of reading in the last year. I've read every article and paper that I can find on the climate and ecological crisis. I've spoken to a lot of experts. So as a scientist, I know how to understand information and analyze primary sources and make sure that things are true that I'm saying. And also in the world of the pandemic right now, I've spent the last week kind of barely leaving my computer trying to get up to date on all the science and making sure that I know as far as possible what it is that we should be trusting. And I'm also, in terms of perceived as being an authority, I think being on the television helps, being on quiz shows, being on quite mainstream stuff. So it's about not just what information you're giving as an expert, but who you are and why people should trust you, and what your sources are and why people should trust those. And then the third part of the argument that often gets missed, again, by scientists or by anyone who's an expert, is that the pathos, the emotional side of the argument, the appeal to the emotions. So, you know, what is actually going to happen if we don't, you know, bring our carbon emissions down from this year down to by 50% by 2030, to net zero by 2050. You know, what's actually going to happen to individuals? You know, are we going to be looking at food shortages? Well, probably yes. You know, are we going to be looking at spread of disease? Well, probably yes, because of heightened temperatures. Are we going to be looking at changes to our weather systems, more rain, more floods, more droughts? In this in European countries, certainly more floods, and that could lead to knock-on effects of yields of crops, to food shortages, and you know, if we keep on going to civil unrest and to kind of very unstable communities. So it's really bringing that into the personal. And with COVID, with coronavirus, it's bringing it into, you know, do you have someone in your life that is over 70? Do you have someone in your life that is vulnerable, that has an underlying health condition, that has challenges with asthma, with their lungs, with their immune system? And, you know, really trying to persuade people to stay home and to self-isolate, to socially distance, based on the fact that, you know, if people are walking around in the street, even if they don't have symptoms, it might be that if you walk around in the street, you could pick up the virus from them, you could then bring it home and transfer it to that relative of yours who you care deeply about and who you might unwittingly be passing on the disease to, the virus to. So it's about bringing in the personal, the emotional content. Totally. I think Greta Thunberg does this very, very well. You know, for everything she says, she gives the logic. You know, we have 8 years till we run out of our carbon budget if we want 66% chance of staying below 1.5, which is absolutely imperative. She gives that logical argument. She backs it by saying this is what the IPCC are recommending. This is what is advocated by the UN Secretary General, by heads of state, by really important and trustworthy people. And then she appeals to the emotions. She says, how dare you, why are you killing our children? Why are you making the lives of our children, our grandchildren unsafe? Do you have children? How can you let them grow up in this world? And she appeals to the emotion in that way.
And we've actually got an audience question that just came in that kind of deals with some of these things.
Great.
From Simon, tooting our own horn a bit here, but we've started working on a format that is simply and explicitly as possible correlates data on climate change and the impact of corona. I wonder what your opinion is here. A lot of people say that it's not the time to make people even more afraid by saying that the climate crisis will be so much more worse than this coronavirus. But our opinion is that if this isn't the time to give an understanding of how scary climate change is, then when is?
Yeah, I that's a wonderful question, and it's such an important issue. And honestly, I don't know the answer. On the one hand, you're right. Everyone's really frightened right now. And the most important thing that I feel that I can be doing in this moment as a science communicator is trying to get people to stay at home and trying to get people to understand the importance of self-isolation, even if you're young and fit and healthy. In fact, particularly if you're young and fit and healthy, because you will be the vectors, the carriers who can transfer it to those who are more vulnerable. And that we're seeing young, fit and healthy people very, very sick in hospitals already with coronavirus. So it's not something that just impacts the elderly or the vulnerable. However, I do completely agree that, if we come back from this, when we come back from this, if we haven't in the meantime raised even more awareness about the climate and ecological crisis, then we're going to go back to business as usual. In fact, even more so, because there's, the fossil fuel companies are currently asking for billions of pounds to bail them out, to tide them over whilst in the meantime of the pandemic. And this is the worst thing that could be happening. And yes, we are seeing that there are certainly many viruses, corona maybe not, that are being increased their transmission due to warmer climates, dengue fever and malaria, to name but a few, that because of higher temperatures throughout the year, they're being transmitted more effectively because warmer climates aid transmission. There's conflicting evidence in terms of coronavirus itself, because there's some evidence that vitamin D can actually help to slow down and make people perhaps less able to contract coronavirus. Not that in any way should prevent people from needing to do absolute social isolation and distancing, but there is some suggestion that it might be in the summer months that we do see a slowing of coronavirus, but that's not to be mistaken for or mistakenly kind of correlated with, okay, well then climate change is good, because actually it's climate change itself that is leading to thawing of ice that might be releasing viruses that have been trapped for centuries, if not millennia. Climate change is also leading to loss of habitats, to animals moving around where they shouldn't be, to changes in our ecosystems that is leading to viruses and diseases traveling to parts of the world where they shouldn't be seen, and maybe new viruses and diseases occurring. So yeah, I think this is a great time for us to be really talking about the fact that climate change may well have been influential in this current epidemic, and that we should be absolutely using this opportunity as well to say that it's not just enough to be looking at this current pandemic, but that we need to be looking at how we come back from this in terms of making climate and ecological change an absolute priority. There's no doubt that right now we're seeing reduced emissions and less pollution, and it's wonderful. And we're seeing kind of birds starting to sing in areas where they've never been heard before. There was a beautiful video of Wuhan on BBC recently of hearing birds singing that is just totally unknown there, and it's wonderful. But that's not going to be enough. It's absolutely not going to be enough. Otherwise, we're just going to come back with a vengeance with fossil fuel emissions after this pandemic is hopefully over.
Yeah, totally. And I'm so sorry that we've run out of time, I think. But it's been so lovely to talk to you, and thank you so much for being here. And yeah, we're all gonna follow what happens next, and hopefully things get better. but hopefully some of us decide to not take planes in the future too.
Yeah, that would be great. That's a really important thing that we can all do to help.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much. And for those tuning in, I'll be back in a couple minutes with our next and final session.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, bye.
Hello, everyone. We're back, and I'm so excited to introduce two incredible filmmakers, directors Lauren DeFilippo and Catherine Gorange, to talk about their new documentary film, Red Heaven. It's a science film that doesn't really fit that traditional sort of science film model. And I'm really excited to be talking about it right now. So Lauren and Catherine, tell me a little bit about Red Heaven. How did the film come to be, and what's it generally about?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Lauren and I we went to grad school together. We were in Stanford's documentary film and video program. And while we were there, we were graduating and in the heart of Silicon Valley in California, and just thinking a lot about what people were talking about at that time, just about the future for humanity. And this was a time when space exploration and humans going to Mars was becoming very popular in the media, and just more in our culture than it had been in a long time. And it was also this time when climate change was becoming a real threat to the future of humanity. And we were really asking some questions as a culture about what direction we wanted to go in. And we just thought that there was something there in the way that we're so eager to go into space and put humans on another planet. And it wasn't just about the science of exploring Mars. It was about a human colony on Mars and terraforming Mars and really building a civilization there. And so we just started to do research on possible stories that we could look into and what we could film, that just to start exploring making a film about this. And we found out about the high seas Mars simulation, and immediately we were just like, this is it. It's people living for an entire year, a very lived experience on simulated Mars, and it's a real NASA experiment, so very scientifically rigorous. And we called them up and we're like, we want to make a documentary. And immediately they said, no, you can't make a documentary. This is a real science experiment. Go away. And but we knew that the crew was going to be in Hawaii for their kind of last days on Earth. So they said we could come film in the last couple weeks before they went into the dome. And so on a chance, we just flew to Hawaii and built relationships with the researchers and the crew, and eventually came up with this agreement to collaborate and give them cameras to film their experience, because we obviously wouldn't be able to shoot during month 3 when they're in a science experiment where they're supposed to be believing that they're on Mars.
Yeah, so you basically gave these 6 crew members cameras to shoot themselves for a whole year. And yeah, give us a little teaser, like what, and this documentary obviously covers that year. What is life on this simulated Mars like? What happens?
Well, it was interesting because it's sort of like a bunch of scientists in a dome, pretty like rational, in a way, sort of quiet people, I guess you could say. So we were at first a little concerned about like, what's actually going to happen? Are these good characters? What, is there going to be any drama here? And just as time went on, things began to happen when people are isolated from everything that they're used to in the world. Kind of new things emerge. And so definitely some conflict in the crew arose. I think what was most interesting to us, though, was really kind of the moments when they could have walked out when things got tough, and they could have just headed out that door and would be back in Hawaii, no big deal. And yet they really tried to figure out ways to continue to survive and to make it work inside, even when, things like a water shortage happens, or when they can't be in touch with friends and family during kind of crises going on Earth. And so, that's what we were really interested to kind of see unfold. And then I think also what was unique about this film was that, obviously they're filming themselves. So it sort of became a way, the camera kind of became a way for people to express themselves. Initially, it was like one woman was doing a lot of the filming. And as things kind of got more difficult inside for all 6 of them, they all started picking up the camera and kind of using the camera as a way to express their experience inside and kind of what they were dealing with, almost, more like a diary or something like that. So that was cool for us to see.
And do you mind sharing some production stills and sort of talking us through the visual language? Like, what are these people and what does this place look like?
Sure. Yeah. Catherine, you want to put that up?
Sure. Here we go.
I mean, that looks like Mars.
Yeah, and actually the choice for the Big Island of Hawaii is pretty intentional. It has really similar geology to Mars. This is actually all pretty new lava rock, and so they did it not just because the visual is real, but because the astronauts, habonauts, as they were called, could actually go out on the landscape and do some geological tasks. And that also would be a pretty authentic simulation.
So this is their dome. It was about 1,200 square feet. There were 2 floors. The bottom floor was just a pretty much shared work kitchen dining area, and then they had on the second floor basically these little tiny, almost like pie slices of bedrooms that each crew member had. Very little privacy. You can basically hear everything that goes on in there at all times. You know, 2 little porthole windows. You can see one on the side there. And that was really their only source of sunlight. And, you know, obviously became a really important featured part of the dome for them was the portholes. It was also, you know, run sustainably. So you'll see there the solar panels, it was all solar powered. They had a limited amount of water that they were trying to live on. They sort of took it on as a personal challenge to try and restrict their water use even more. So they ended up taking, you know, I think by the end of it, they were taking like 30-second showers, something crazy like that.
Once a week.
Once a week, yeah.
Pretty gross.
It got pretty smelly in that dome, to say the least.
And what sort of activities were they able to do in there? I mean, I think we're all sort of stuck inside in our homes right now. I mean, what can we learn from their activities?
Well, actually, I was just seeing that that there was a man in France who's social distancing pretty intensely right now, who ran a marathon on his balcony that was only 7 meters long. He just ran back and forth for, I think it took him like over 6 hours. And Tristan, who's one of our subjects who was in the dome, he ran a marathon on a treadmill while he was in there. So that's kind of a direct similarity, but I think there are so many that just, it's in a way similar to our world, what's happening right now, but they even had the added disadvantage of not being able to have real-time conversations like we're having now remotely, because they had to simulate the way communication would actually be on Mars, which is to simulate the distance that it would take a signal to travel. And that's 20 minutes each way. So anytime anyone communicated, it was a 40-minute delay. And so they were incredibly isolated. And I think when you watch the film, it's kind of seeing what we're going through now, but in the extreme where it's like, okay, what do I do with my time if I'm not going out, if I'm not going to work, if I can't have conversations that I have normally? And it really kind of strips people down into your basic needs as a human.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a topical subject right now. You've made a film about the psychological toll of human isolation in a lot of ways in a time now when we're all of a sudden finding ourselves doing that. What did each of you learn about the effects of isolation while making this film and really getting to know these 6 characters?
Well, I think, you know, the main takeaway for us from the start was just the importance of Earth and our own environment. You know, as much as this is a film about Mars, it's really a film about Earth and our relationship to our own planet. And you just so viscerally see how they miss being outside. You know, they can only go outside in spacesuits, which they really lean into and are, you know, love going on what they call EVAs, extravehicular activities. But even so, they're always wearing spacesuits. They can't actually touch the rocks. They can't feel the wind on their face. And so it becomes a really big dilemma for them in a lot of ways. And then I think also for me, just personally, kind of the loss of connection between your family and friends. Some of them ended up kind of feeling as though they'd been forgotten by family, just because it's hard to write an email. It's hard to communicate in that way exclusively. And so I think they just kind of really felt untethered in terms of like their own social networks outside of the dome.
Did some of them fare better than others? Like, what were sort of some of the extreme things that happened?
Yeah, I think definitely some fared better than others, but it was also kind of moment to moment. And something that we learned is that in any kind of isolation or simulation like this, there's kind of 4 quadrants of experience. And maybe we'll all start going through that as we fare the next several months of social distancing because of coronavirus. But in the first month, there's a lot of kind of excitement. And I even see some of my friends going through that now. That's like, okay, as long as I can afford to take time off work or I can work remotely, it's kind of exciting, actually. It's nice to be a homebody, and I'm getting the stuff done in my house that I always wanted to, and I'm reading books again and all these kinds of things. And then the monotony kind of starts to settle in the second quarter. And then the third quarter is the dreaded third quarter syndrome, where, and this is true for Antarctic exploration, people who live at McMurdo, and it's true for even they've like backdated journals of sea voyages to kind of look at how people fare emotionally and socially. And it really starts to drop off in the third quarter, where the end is still so far away, and the newness has definitely worn off. And that's where it got really intense for all of them. And everyone was kind of pushed to their limits, just whether it was boredom, whether it was social isolation. So Tristan, one of our subjects, said this amazing thing where he was like, you start to have this inner dialogue with yourself that feels almost metaphysical, because when there's no internet, there's no social media, that's just you and yourself, and there are 5 other people there, but sometimes they wouldn't talk to each other for days because they were just so used to each other or sick of each other or whatever it was. And then finally the fourth quarter comes and they start to realize there's light at the end of the tunnel, and spirits finally begin to lift.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we're already seeing that first that first excitement now. And hopefully we're not in this situation for a whole year. And I would encourage the audience too, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in. So we've been talking a lot about sort of science communication today. Do you guys think of this as a science film? Like, how did you think about communicating the science in the film as you were making it?
Well, actually, when we were conceiving of it, we were thinking of it as a kind of a science nonfiction, almost like a take on sci-fi, because we were like, this is a science fiction film, but it's nonfiction because they're actually on Earth and it's a simulation, it's a real experiment. And that kind of guided us because, like many sci-fi films, we wanted it to have real science. We wanted it to be authentic and rigorous and have something that people can really attach themselves to and engage with. That's real life, that's real science. But at the same time, like many sci-fi films, it has a psychological element. It's really about asking these larger questions about who we are as human beings. And so that was kind of a guide for us, a reference for us. And, and looking at a lot of sci-fi films where it's this psychological, almost unraveling, where it's just you're tracking every moment, people changing in this very foreign, futuristic situation, even though ours is taking place in the present.
Yeah, and I think too, there's no sort of voice of God narrator in this film. There's no CGI graphics. There's no sort of typical science film tropes, if you will. And instead, you're using footage captured by the scientists themselves who are participants. What was that like working with these 6 scientists? How cooperative were they? Were they excited to be part of a film? Did they understand what was happening with you guys?
Well, I think kind of going back to what I was saying just about how are these people going to be as subjects? How interesting are a group of scientists? Something we talk about a lot is that, the people who we really need to send to Mars, if we were to do that, are kind of the most even-keeled, people who can handle extreme stress, can handle extreme boredom, can kind of embrace boredom in a way. So, we were like, is this what you really want in a documentary subject, to be just kind of like even-keeled? And so, things did happen, and they did, I think, because of the intense circumstances they were under, kind of began to reveal themselves more and more on a personal level. And so I think, people just kind of dealt with it in their own individual ways. And for some people that was better than others. But I think that, just going, I'm sorry, your question was,
just, what was it like working with them? I mean,
yeah.
how did you guys direct them from another planet almost? I mean, they had all of these communication barriers in place. I mean, how did you make sure that you got the footage that you needed? And do you think, and another question is, do you think that you guys being there with them affected the science experiment in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, we were definitely concerned about that. It was a learning curve, I think, on both sides. I think as any documentary subject, kind of didn't realize how intimate we wanted to get. And, so we were always emailing them questions, emailing them ideas for shot lists of things we wanted to see. And then they would upload us footage and we would kind of respond to that. But, in the end, it ended up very much just like them kind of handing us a lot of footage when they came out that we didn't even know they were shooting. But I think it was funny because in the beginning, it was like they would send us these like 3-second clips. And we were like, no, guys, like, please just like put the camera on a tripod, put it down on a table, just let it roll. And I think once we kind of started to get into that mode of working with them, they began to understand the process of what we were going for a little bit more. So it was definitely a process on both sides, I think, of understanding kind of how to direct in a situation like that and for them to really embrace the project.
Have you talked to any of them recently about the pandemic and how they're feeling? Just curious about the similarities of their experience and what we're going through now.
Yeah, we talked to Cyprian recently, who was actually supposed to be with us at CPH. And
on this panel right now.
And on the panel as we speak. And of course, that was canceled. And he was just very sweet and very sympathetic about the release of the film, of course, kind of being, a little sidetracked for the moment. But he was also just saying he's getting a ton of requests now because everyone wants to know how to deal with extreme isolation. And so a lot of news articles and just people trying to deal.
Did he have any tips for us?
Well, definitely what a lot of them said is just having number one tasks to do, any kind of, just keep your mind off the boredom and the isolation, basically. Exercise was a huge thing for them. They were actually tasked with mandatory exercise. They had to do an hour of exercise every day because that's what astronauts would have to do on Mars to keep your muscles intact and your bones. And but they ended up doing way more than that just because it kind of helped them psychologically keep the endorphins up, have something to do. And even though they did become so isolated from each other and there was crew conflict, their moments of togetherness were so important. They continued to have crew dinners as an entire crew throughout the mission and dole out the responsibilities of cooking the whole time. And even when sometimes no one was speaking to each other, they would still have dinner together. And that still went a long way just to be able to have some sense of togetherness regardless of the circumstance.
Yeah, and we've been talking today a lot too about audience for science films and how do we reach new audiences? What is the audience that you hope will tune in to this film?
Yeah, well, Lauren and we actually are not, I don't think either of us ever thought that we would make a science film necessarily. But actually we might make another science film after this. But now we're hooked. But we really came at it, like I said, from this, from wanting to ask these larger questions about human beings. And we then realized we were making a film that was really about science. And I think we our audience will be reflective of that, because it's people who might be interested in science who wouldn't necessarily watch a hardcore, very factual, very informative science documentary. But when it's this human story, when it has this narrative to it that can really invite people in who wouldn't normally watch that kind of film, and then it invites a whole new audience to watch something that is actually scientific and about a real experiment.
Did you, in the making of this film, did your views on whether we should be trying to go to Mars and colonize Mars change at all?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. We started out from a pretty skeptical place with people going to Mars. We were kind of just like, Elon Musk, is this really what we need to be talking about right now? Like, our planet is in crisis and we're going to another one, carrying all of our problems with us to this new place. So yeah, we kind of came at it from a pretty cynical place. And I think, going through the process of learning more about Mars, although they don't appear in the film, we actually did interview a lot of amazing writers, particularly science fiction writers like Kim Stanley Robinson. We interviewed the wonderful Mary Roach, who is just like a national treasure, wrote a great book called Packing for Mars about Mars simulations. And, in doing so, I think we kind of, our appreciation for Mars really grew in terms of what exploring another planet can do for us here on Earth, kind of the comparative planetology approach of looking at Mars to understand Earth better. And then I think some things emerged for us too, just about human resilience and like just the need to challenge ourselves, that I think we kind of started to understand in a little bit different way, that I think was a little bit more sympathetic to what people are trying to do with with venturing to Mars. But Catherine, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think so much of what we had been hearing just in the media and when we were in Silicon Valley was about this kind of like, we're going to terraform Mars, and Elon Musk is like, we're going to nuke it and create an atmosphere and put people on there and create a whole new civilization. And once we got closer to the high seas experiment, it's just a completely different world. It just is a real scientific approach. And they really want to send people because robots can only do so much. They're like, if we could do it with robots, we would. But a human being, if you send a robot, you're sending a robot that you designed years before, just because of how long it takes to actually get a robot to Mars. Mm-hmm. And so by the time it gets to Mars, sometimes the technology is old and the robot will see something and you're like, oh, we actually want it to drill and see if there's anything under that rock. And we're like, oh, the robot doesn't have that capability. But so then you have to design a new robot and like do the process all over again. But when you send a human being, we're so obviously versatile and have our own brains and have opposable thumbs. And, we can kind of roll with the punches and think creatively. And there's so much that you could do if you can send a human being to Mars. It would be incredible science. So it's just a completely different realm. And that's like really the way that they're thinking about it, is like, how can we best do, whether it's comparative planetology or the search for life, the best way to do that is to send a human being. So a lot of these people are even on the fence about sending human beings, but they're like, if this is the best science that we can do, let's figure out how to do it.
Yeah, I think us starting out in Silicon Valley with the genesis of this film kind of put us in a dark place in some ways. We were kind of like looking at all these like entrepreneurs and venture capitalists talking about Mars as this real like economic opportunity. And that was just a total turnoff to both of us. And I think once we kind of started looking at the other reasons for going to Mars and what can be gained and just better approaches, I think all around, we definitely came around.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. I think we're about out of time, unless there's something that either of you would like to end on. Any thought or, I don't know.
I think just given our current situation right now, living in isolation, it's something we've been thinking about a lot. And the one thing I think I really learned from the Dome was just about, this is like kind of like a small thing, but I just mean it as like a helpful thing to people out there, is sort of like tracking your time. I think, they really experienced kind of what they called the time blur inside the Dome, where time just gets wonky. You totally lose all sense of it. And I've just been thinking about like kind of lessons from isolation that I've learned through this film. And I think just really trying to maintain a schedule. I know it sounds small, but I really think it is a form of keeping your sanity. And, I think if they all did it for a year, I just have such a greater appreciation for what they went through already in there, So I think that hopefully the film can kind of resonate with people in that way, and they can kind of take some of these lessons learned and apply to what we're going through now.
Yeah, totally. We all need to exercise and make calendars and stay as connected as possible.
I know it sounds like a boring lesson, but I really have been feeling it lately.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining. We all can't wait to see this film out in the world. And this ends our programming for today. So a huge thank you to the whole CPH staff for making this happen so quickly and changing the entire technology platform in such a short period of time. I know you've been working around the clock to do it. And to everyone out there, stay safe and healthy and sane in these coming weeks. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Take care.